Good evening, everyone. It's great to have you with us tonight in our Wednesday night Facebook Live. Thank you so much for tuning in, and it's going to be a really good discussion tonight. We have Dr. Watts with us, and I know you're going to have a lot of questions that you would like to ask. So Pastor Eddie will be on the computer ready to take your questions, and we'll be sharing that. But for now, I want to say thank you for being here. I want to remind you that this Sunday we're starting a new series on worship. And I think you'll enjoy it, so we encourage you to be here for that. And you should be here next Sunday. You're going to get a little bit extra sleep, and you should be here on time, right? So we're looking forward to a great weekend, and God's doing good things. So having said that, we're going to go right into our time here, and I'm going to ask a prayer on what we receive, what we hear, what we give and share, and we just wish the best for each of you. Lord Jesus, thank you so much for loving us. Thank you that you see us, you know us, where we're at, what we're going through. And we are living in challenging times, but we got an almighty God. You are a miracle working God, a powerful God, a wise God, and you love us. And so we're looking to you, Lord, to walk us through this season of our lives and continue to bless. And we're just praying for your strength in the lives of those that are watching us tonight. If there are any sick out there, we ask for your healing power to be on them. Any are weak, any are struggling. Please, Lord, touch them right now and help them be healed and encouraged and strengthened. I pray for any need that anyone has there and any question that anyone has. If there's someone that's listening tonight that doesn't know you as Lord and Savior, I pray something that we say tonight will spur them to surrender totally to you and find that you are the source of our strength and everything that touches our lives that we need. So, God, we give you this time for your glory. We pray that you will be honored in it. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So, thank you for checking in. Eddie, do we have people checking in already?
Yep, my mom says hey, Miss Margaret Jackson says hey, and Miss Amanda says hey so far, but we do have more people in here.
All right.
Just make sure y'all are liking and sharing and commenting so we know y'all are here and so we can talk to y'all.
Okay. Well, again, Dr. Watts is with us tonight. We had him with us a few weeks ago, and the response was overwhelming, and many of you asked if we could do it again. So here he is, Dr. Watts, with us, and he's had a very busy schedule. Of course, he always does, but he's had some interesting things going on in his work at the clinic, and so I'm sure that he'll have some great things to share. So I've got a couple of questions I want to ask you, and if there's anything that you want to say to people that are watching, I'll just start with the question, and maybe some others will have a question. That'd be all right?
Sure, that's fine.
A question that I was asked, though, was can you differentiate between flu symptoms and COVID-19 symptoms? And I think they were saying early on, when I'm coughing or I have an allergy or whatever, how do I really know this isn't the flu or this isn't COVID or this isn't the cat that's in the room to give me an allergy? I mean, what is it? What is it I really need to know that might be a red flag for me?
Well, unfortunately, COVID has 13 main symptoms, and it overlaps with allergies, the common cold, which includes other coronaviruses and other viruses. Mm-hmm. It overlaps with flu. It overlaps with gastrointestinal diseases. Mm-hmm. And so when we go through the list, we say fever, cough, shortness of breath, but then we add loss of taste, loss of smell. Then we get into the flu-like symptoms, which would be like the severe fatigue, muscle aches, myalgia. So that'd be one thing besides a dry cough with flu, but they all overlap. You can have the fever with the flu, you can have the sore throat with the flu, and just like you can with COVID, and of course a headache can come with the flu or COVID. And then you have the conjunctiva, it's like introducing by touching, that was apparently all of just don't touch anything. They forgot the respiratory, which is the most important part of it. But unfortunately, it is a respiratory spread infection, and that is one of the easiest to spread types of infection, typically is respiratory-borne illnesses. Then we besides that, the nausea, vomiting, the loose stools, or the frank diarrhea, you can get a rash that's nonspecific that comes with other viruses. We call it a viral xanthan. And then the typical cold-like symptom, nasal congestion, sneezing. So typically, younger people are going to be more like cold symptoms. So they may not even know that they have COVID. They might, now the loss of taste or smell going away, the fatigue. Two of the most common initial symptoms that are experienced by people, if they are positive for COVID, they of course concur with other things.
With everybody, it's real common with everybody.
It's fairly common. You know, none of them are 100%. You know, we probably the most, if it's a first line symptom and they are positive, that's the key. If they're positive, you know, it's over 60%, for instance, the fatigue. So that's a fairly high incidence one. None of them are a whole lot higher than that. But when you have real severe COVID, one of my patients who is 83 years old today had most all of the symptoms, except she didn't have the conjunctival injection, but she had the diarrhea and the nausea. And she still has loss of taste. Unfortunately, when I treated her, she didn't approach me until a week after she was tested by another entity. And so when she wasn't getting better, she finally called the office. And of course, the key is early treatment. And we look at. So the difficulty with this thing is not too many doctors or enough of a soothsayer to really separate all of those, because you may have one or all or potentially none in getting the COVID. You know, when we find out that people, and we're finding out how our antibodies react and different things that cause somebody that's asymptomatic is more likely to be like a T helper cell rather than an antibody reaction. The people that have these huge antibody reaction, which happens to be more likely to be older people, younger people are more likely to directly attack this virus without the antibody reaction. Those are the ones that we have the greatest concern, and that's what we call a cytokine crisis. That's where the immune system is attacking where the virus is now infested. And that's actually a destruction of your own organs by your own immune system. So we don't see that very often. You know, a statistic that might be of interest to them is we just had the statistic that was released by one of our credible sources that tabulates all this. We had in the school-age children all the way on down, we had 74 deaths that were attributed to COVID. We had just under 500 that were flu related. So we know that younger people have a very low risk. So that's 1/7 the risk of flu based on that.
So they're many times more likely to die of the flu than COVID.
It is. And the other interesting part about that, we had less flu cases than we normally have had. So it could have been a lot more than that in any given year. So so it was almost a 7-to-1. We saw that same thing with babies, you know, through July 15th. We had about 4 infants that had died, we think mostly related to COVID and complications. And
In the United States?
In the whole United States.
4 babies?
For the all 50 states. But,
wow.
And we had 11 with flu back in that June 15th. But our total tabulation with all school-age children, you know, that would be in the upper teens all the way down was 74 as of last week. So it does tell us something. We have actually learned why are they susceptible at that time. Now we know that there's an autoimmune process that develops. One is to interferon 1, which is a mediator that is one of our defense mechanisms, and your own body develops an immunity and attacks it and prevents it from doing its service to you. But typically the average death today is 78, and the average person has 2.6 comorbidities, which might be diabetes, could be heart disease, could be lung disease. Obesity is actually a very large one, and others that are slightly less common in numbers as you go down the list.
Wow, that's
so
interesting.
I didn't answer a good question because it would be nice to have this secret tabulation of which one is flu and which. And it is so complicated that we actually have one of the entities that's giving us a swab that does flu and COVID together, and that should be hopefully available within about 4 weeks. And so it means we're not too smart really yet. I wish we could separate out those, but at average, we got 5 disease entities that COVID can mask and be part of.
Yeah.
They can be the same as any one or all of their symptoms.
So when I've got a bad allergy, I'm coughing, just having a hard time, I don't, what do I do? Do I go get tested anyhow? Because I know every time everybody gets a cold, they don't need to run to the clinic.
No, but unfortunately, that's what we're having to do because of common cold. The reason we test somebody with a common cold, like especially a younger person, it's not that we're in fear of their life, we're in fear of the lives around them. So the idea of testing is to prevent spread to somebody that might be susceptible. So it's to protect mom and dad, to protect grandpa and grandma, or that maybe a classmate that might be immunocompromised, a transplant patient. And I used to be in residency, worked on a transplant team at Loma Linda with heart, and so these were kids that had transplants from age 0 at birth. We did it immediately upon delivery, and so you have somebody like that. Those are things that you're trying to protect others. Really, it's not likely that you would have a real severe outcome, but it's to prevent everybody else. And of course, we've spent trillions of dollars on this disease process. We're approaching the same amount we spent on this as what we spent on shock and awe that whole first year.
Wow. Yes.
That's a scary thing, and then they're talking about spending another equivalent amount, which is going to be disastrous for our young people. Please forgive us in advance for what we've done to you in your future.
So we're not too worried about the children's outcome, but when the child comes to see their grandparent or great-grandparent and
that's
has
the
it,
key.
Then we don't want that to happen either. And so we've got to be really careful about self-diagnosis when we're...
It is very careful because a doctor can't tell the difference. So I'm not saying that we're smarter than anybody in the population, but we should know more about things because we're exposed to a lot of things and trained. And so when you take at least 13 plus symptoms, and you can have all of the symptoms and pretty much any one of those other disease entities, we're not smart enough to do that without some form of testing. And our testing still has loopholes too. So that's why you see people being confined because there's a chance that our tests could, like for instance, these antigen or quick tests can be missing in the neighborhood of 40+% of the diagnosis. And so in our clinic with the fast test, we're working out a thing. If we suspect COVID, if it's positive, we'll accept it as positive. If it's negative, we're going to do the reflex test, which is PCR. That's the genetic polymerase chain reaction test, which amplifies, whatever it picks up. Like we can pick up just a few cells and you can detect those few cells, but it's not perfect yet either. Germany has developed some things in the 99+% range, but right now costs would be an issue. Given the fact that we're spending just over $1 billion a week on testing alone, that's a major bill to our economy.
Yeah.
Just in that one little area.
Yeah.
With that brought up, we have a question.
Okay.
Timmy Mazingo wanted to know if you have a health condition such as like asthma or some kind of, breathing condition, how often should you get tested for COVID?
Okay, that's a good question because we're wasting a lot of tests. The statement by the CDC is not until you have symptoms.
Okay.
And so what we're doing, and unfortunately schools don't know what to deal with this, and we're not really good about sending it down from our state because right now the state has individual liberties on how they manage. Schools want to have a test to say yes, we have something, or no, we don't. The truth of the matter is every test has a big loophole in it that it may still miss it. So we've got to still have a degree of caution. Now with kids, if you were going to ask me how I'd run it, that would be a different set of circumstances. But I would not just go do routine testing. Now, being the hypocrite that I might be called, somebody, if you've been to the clinic, some of you might have seen me on Mondays and Thursdays, I'm being tested. And I don't have symptoms. And why is that? Because I'm working in a nursing home that's had some deaths. And we've spread between individuals. So I am tested actually twice a week just because I'm in a certain nursing home. When they're on category red or they're in a major observation trying to stop a big outbreak, everybody is tested and the residents are tested. But in general, the population probably should not do that without
Right,
any real
right.
cause or need.
And you're doing that not for your own safety, but for your patient's safety.
It's for my patient's safety. When somebody sees me wearing an N95 mask and I'm wearing a shield, that is not me being afraid of you. That is to protect the patients inside that building. In our clinic model, we keep the sick people outside. We'll bring them outside the inn, but not in the inner circle where the waiting room is. We're trying to keep that safe place for two reasons. One, the employees have to have a degree of safety. They don't want to know that somebody randomly is walking around with COVID. So we have to protect the employees. But the other thing is, I don't want my 90-year-olds that are coming to see me to have concern of risk of that. And if I happen to be asymptomatic, I don't want to be spreading. Now, this, you may not like what I'm going to tell you right now, but because we probably would not do this, but the government has provision that a healthcare provider can have COVID and still take care of you.
I've heard that, but that makes very little sense to me.
Well, it does if you know what you're doing, meaning I could still work and I could be perfectly safe for you by, if I wear an N95 mask, I have almost zero projection in front of me. I might have a little leak when I sneeze or cough, top or bottom. Then I put a facial shield around it. And if I do proper hygiene, like I try to do all the time, wash before and after each and every patient. So I'm actually washing twice per patient.
Yeah.
And when we expose now outside, we go through another layer theoretically than that. You know, we put on the full head net and I have a plastic suit and things like that. Contact is a concern, but I just got to teach myself not to be touching my face.
Yeah.
You know, the introduction is this conjunctiva, you know. So there is a protection faction that I have, but my main concern is to protect my patient. And so if I wear a facial shield for myself, there is a cough projecting in front of me. So the advantage of saying every patient comes into that clinic and it needs to wear a mask is that I'm now preventing the accidental spread of somebody that doesn't have a fever that comes into that building. So even if they've got a cloth mask, which will stop a sneeze to 18 inches or less, depending if it's a single or multi-layer, and a surgical mask roughly 4 to 6 inches, and N95 almost 0 inches other than leakage around the seal.
Yeah.
So that patient is protecting the staff if they cough or sneeze too. If I have an N95, I do have a filtering process that filters out, and I may reduce the viral load. So viral load is a means of drawing an infection. How much you get inoculated with at that given moment makes a difference as to what level of disease you might have. If you have just a small volume of viruses and a very minimal aerosol, you're much better off than a large load that you were to take directly in the face from cough or sneeze that you might inhale.
We're hearing a lot right now about a spike in COVID cases. I'm not sure if that's a spike in deaths. What's the truth? Is there a spike? And
there's a spike in cases, and there's a couple of reasons for it. Every time we lock down and restrict people, we can expect a spike. So, I mean, if you want to just keep people locked down for the rest of their life, I guess we can do that. Problem is, people don't stay locked down. So we really didn't accomplish much with our lockdown. You probably remember the spring break and things like that. But the truth of the matter is, we have a new virus that's really not the same. It's the same category. It's SARS-CoV-2, but now we're in the G614. Now, the first one was a D class, and so we have over 4,000 mutations later, and this one's 3 times as infective, meaning its ability to share its RNA and DNA through the host receptor site as the first one that we had. But our death rate is going down. And
so that's really a
very
big number.
That's a very encouraging sign.
More so when we're looking at more cases being diagnosed, but the
Lower
death coming down, the differential is growing, which is very encouraging.
Yeah, and there's a lot of reasons for that. We're not absolutely certain, but most of these viruses, if you let them replicate far enough, usually they don't become more virulent, but they become less virulent over time. So
You're talking about the mutation itself?
the mutation itself. They're more likely to become less dangerous over a period of time. And then, when we look at innate versus acquired immunity and other formats on there, as our population gets exposed to this over a period of time, that there is going to be an ability to resist this that's going to be higher. There's other things that take place on this. So people that don't believe in vaccines need to be really careful about their knowledge and wisdoms.
Okay.
Because there is, turns out, other coronaviruses that you've been exposed to, a common cold, actually can give you an acquired immunity through another disease that's not exactly the same, but it's similar in some features. And we also know that certain vaccines that you've had that can actually give you immunity to this COVID virus. Well, one that's being studied is the tuberculosis vaccine.
Oh, really?
And nearly a 50% protection rate with something that wasn't even intended for COVID. So we've things that we're learning about, and we got to figure out what's real in this world and what's not real. So, when we look at controversial statements, it's good to research out and not accept everything that we hear.
So since you were talking about like vaccines, we had someone ask a lot earlier when you were bringing up flu. I just couldn't cut you off. Y'all were in a good conversation. They asked just blatantly, do you recommend a flu shot for all ages? And I guess if not, what ages do you think the flu shot is?
Well, we don't give flu shots to the real young children, like three months down. But, our flu shots right now could be good for almost any age group at this point. They're not living, or at least the ones we get. You can order live virus flu shots. The clinic as a whole, we've not wanted to give live virus because normally you separate that out for immune compromised people, don't get live virus flu shots. People 60 and above or 4 and below. And so you put all the pressure on your nurses to screen, so we don't give live virus flu shots, which means you cannot get the flu, which is the most common statement. Now, back when you and I were in college, guess what? All we had was live virus flu shots. So you actually could get the flu. So that's what people have a tendency to
Well, we got a
remember.
lot of anecdotal data on that, including myself. When first time I took a flu shot, a vaccine, I got real sick afterwards, but you're telling me it wasn't the flu, it was just a...
Well, no, you could have back in early days because that was a living virus. But today, not likely. You can get an immune response. Now, here's one of the things. The statistics are just over 1 out of 50. When you're in the cold and flu season, when most people are going to get a couple of viruses during cold season, at least 1 or 2, that you've got a 1 out of 50 chance within a 2-week period of you getting that flu shot that you're going to come down with some other virus. So one of the studies that I was involved with, it was just a short state study, people that claimed that they got the flu after the flu shot, we tested them for flu. None of them tested for flu positive on the ones I had. Now, here's the deal with the flu shot, though. You've got to look at another part. The flu shot will not protect you from 100% of the flus. Most of them are only 70% effective to start with, so you're reducing your chance of getting the flu. The other one is you may have a strain that's not even covered by the flu shot. So those things happen. So it's really can be a complicated mess. If you want to come up with your own conspiracy theory about how I got this. But so yes, you can get the flu, and even with the virus that's being covered by that flu shot, like the quadrivalent flu shot virus, reduces the chance that another virus is going to come from China or wherever else and hit here. We're trying to pick the top 4 in the rest of the world, but we're not always 100% right. About 85% of the time we hit all of the viruses that typically make the majority of our cases. But then is the incomplete coverage. Now, if you get a flu shot 2, 3, or 4 times, like if you got flu shots back after H1N1, where we had 30 million cases the first year without the flu shot until end of November, you got them thereafter, you would have had 4 different shots to cover H1N1. So then you would be building up close to a 99.9% immunity at that point by having repetitive H1N1. H1N1 pretty much was beaten down, and then it's come back occasionally because now we have younger people and adults that were exposed and circulated from other countries and came back. But generally, you would have pretty long-term protection once you have multiple vaccines to the same exact virus.
Yeah. Speaking of vaccines, they're telling us we may have a vaccine for COVID pretty soon. And
we actually have it right now. We have several right now. Whether we're going to get them, there was discussion about actually releasing them before the election, and then all of the things about they're rushing it too fast. Well, yeah, I guess to tell the population one thing that would be a good educational thing is we've gone through 6 months of human trials in our country. Now, Russia's human trials are taking place as they're vaccinating their people, but for part of it. And maybe in some cases where something is lethal and you know it's probably safe, it might be better than the disease itself. I don't know. But our country has no. So we got several 100,000 people that have had vaccine already in the studies. And so right now there's 2 of them that just finished this month. And we have 2 that had to sit out for about 4 weeks, and they stopped the data. Each one of them had one person that was sick. One was AstraZeneca, and that was a cooperation with England. And then we had Johnson & Johnson, and they both had it. When you study something like this, there's heart attacks and other disease processes that are, of course, going to affect every participant on there. The problem is we got to decide, was it related to the shot? So they have to stop, study, and evaluate. In some cases, it's possible, but they don't have enough numbers to cover a rare side effect. Then they have to add numbers. Like one request was to add another 15,000 participants to one of the vaccines to make sure that that wasn't some rare side effect that could occur. But right now, we've got 2 that look pretty good, and we've already manufactured these things. So here's the process. We really did not cut corners. We spent a lot more money on this whole thing than we usually would. But the thought was we're throwing away trillions of dollars, get this vaccine, cut the lives, affect the rhetoric from whichever political party's using it.
Right.
And so as soon as they hit phase 3, if they qualified in phase 3 and they met the safety standards and the efficacy standards, the efficacy was what percentage chance that they have of covering that disease, they were given a contract. So we, for instance, Pfizer was the biggest contract. They were, I believe it was about $1.7 billion they were given for 100 million vaccines, which were supposed to be done by December 1st. So right now we have millions of vaccines already made. So the one way we sped this up is because whatever vaccine we're having is coming from these phase 3 trials. It's not going to be any different. So the idea was if you qualify for that, just start manufacturing it so we have it ready when it's done. The other thing to speed this up that was done was that we added a third-party entity. We may or may not be able to always trust the FDA. We know there's been individuals that have been compromised, that have released things and held things back for personal gain. And then we also know that the companies, so we had another third-party entity that was involved in a lot of these things. So they've been studying these all along. So when we have an illness, all 3 of those entities are looking at where that was. They stopped for 4 weeks, analyzed the data, and then decided it probably wasn't related to, which is, I think, what the outcome was on these 2 entities. Then we go forward. So theoretically, we could release it right away. I don't know because of our election if that was one of the reasons it's going to be held, but they were talking about holding it back further, observing those people that had the vaccine back in April, for instance. So we go back with the smaller groups, which are the earliest ones, and we see how they do. Now, if one of them hits something that's kind of a bigger deal, because that would mean that there's a long-range side effect that maybe we didn't anticipate. But right now, there doesn't seem to be a lot of big hitches on that.
Okay,
so.
and I'm sure another question people have about that is when it comes out, should we grab it? Should we take it right away?
Well, my answer to that is yes, as long as it's past the criteria. Now, from my understanding, we're going to have some input as to which one we have. there's going to be winners and losers in this. If somebody's on the bottom of the scale in the efficacy, the clinics and the other people are going to pick the highest. However, if we don't have enough, we might take that one and say, and of course the FDA is going to be involved with that, and say, let's do a booster with that. Say it was at the bare minimum 50% effective. One way you can increase that effectiveness is giving it as a booster shot, you know, a couple months later, for instance.
Is that basically the same shot? Just
Yeah,
getting
same shot,
same
second time,
medication.
which would hyperstimulate, which is what we do like hepatitis, for instance. That's
Yeah.
a 3-shot series.
Right.
I think you had that for the mission trips that you've been on, I believe, but hopefully you did.
I had a lot of shots.
Yeah, and you had some others too. But hepatitis, the reason hepatitis was a 3-shot series, one increases the longevity of the effect of that vaccine. The other one improves the total efficacy. You get into the 99+% range when you have a triple series like that. So something that's not curable, highly lethal, major consequences to society, which it is. I mean, it's a very costly thing to get hepatitis. You'll live quite a while and spend a lot of money of the government. So it's really how much money we save. I mean, it's to say that nobody's interested in our lives, but when something maims you and costs a lot of money, that's the one that they want to have the higher efficacy. Yeah.
Okay, so, but we should feel by the time it gets on the market to us, it should be very safe for us.
It should be very
but
safe.
very efficacious too.
Yes, and they did initially, because of the urgency of this, allow for a lower level of efficacy. Normally we try to hit 70% with the flus. 70% is the minimum that you start with. And they did make provisions that if we couldn't achieve that, at least get to the point of 50% before we rejected all of the flu. Because here was the downside of manufacturing all this. It could all be thrown away if it doesn't meet standard.
If it doesn't work,
Yeah.
billions of
Yeah,
dollars
it's
thrown in the
just thrown away.
dumpster.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see, what else do we need to talk about here? Oh yeah, something that's kind of interested in the news right now, the reoccurrence is that so we assume that when we've had it, we've got an immunity to it, and we can't. But there are some. It seems like not a whole lot of credibility to it, but people that are having people who had COVID-19 getting it again.
Yes, and you know, somebody that was asked to me by a group back in March, and I was smart, not a soothsayer about it. You're always smart in hindsight, but
those are the ones we brag about.
Yeah, that's the ones we. Yeah,
we don't talk
we
about
can
the
be
figures.
dumb in hindsight too when we miss the boat. Like, you know, I started out believing in vitamin D a long time ago. It was 18 years ago, in fact, and I'm looking smarter. Did I know this was going to happen? No, I didn't, but I can take credit for it, I suppose. But no, but but when we look at other viruses, we actually have a history about other coronaviruses. So we had 6 coronaviruses that are part of some of the common colds that we have, which is a constellation of a lot of different viruses. And we actually saw that there could be recurrence of those viruses. Now, I would have to say that in most cases, there was less severity because you had an immune response that was earlier than you would have otherwise had. So an early immune response in the viral replication stage, that's at the beginning, is advantageous. The antibody response that is lethal is when it comes down in the later stage. You know, you plateau, you produce all of the virus you have, and they stop replicating, and you've basically disseminated this virus in your body. And then you have an antibody response. Then it's attacking your organs where this virus is implanted, which is almost every organ in our body with this virus in particular, and that's the dangerous part. But the answer is yes, but we don't have an exact number on that. We think it's going to be a small number in the short term. It will be a gradually larger number as time goes on. It's likely to reduce the severity, though, and that's based on previous experience that we have, and we don't have probably final judgment on that. But there is a degree that, so I would not be real haughty about.
So if you've had the coronavirus and you survived it, still use precautions.
Precautions, that's right. That's kind of like the people that want to get the antibody to see if they were the tough guy that was resistant.
Yeah.
One, I wouldn't trust the antibody reaction because right now there's a 5% false positive. So 1 out of 20 chance that you're going to show you're resistant, and you go out there, it's exposure to every COVID party that you can find, and beware, you've bought into something lacking in wisdom. And so I would say still always protect yourself and others. You know, the same precaution should not stop.
Well, the assumption would be, well, I had the COVID, I'm over it, so I can't get it and I can't give it.
Do not assume that.
Don't assume that. Right. That's what we're saying. Just use universal precautions, just like
it is
always.
It is.
And I think we got a question.
I personally have a question with that though. So because it's not for certain that it's done, is this possibly like a new flu where we could have a COVID season where this could flare up and go up and down? I mean, I know this is speculation, but just the idea of if it is something that you're not completely cured of once you've had it, is it possible that it's just going to be a wave over and over every few years or every year?
Yeah, well, the answer to that question is we're kind of concerned that that is actually exactly what's going to happen.
My assumption would be that, like any flu, that it will mutate over time, and what will inoculate it now, as it mutates, might not be.
Yeah, it might not work later on, and these coronaviruses seem to be mutating at a much faster rate than our influenza viruses. Now, our influenza, we've got over 200 different species. You've heard of H1N1, because that was the easy one to remember, and H1N5, and we got all these things. And we have these subgroups within each one of those that have, now this one that we have right now has at least 6 mutations that are same as this, but are actually slightly different variations of the same virus, but each one of them are independent. For instance, I could go to one state and I could, in some cases, identify which state that they came from by that virus. And they discovered that in Iceland, where they could tell different countries where those people had traveled from, they could tell where that virus was from. So those slight deviations in those things it's constantly mutating. Because remember, we're at least 4,000 mutations away from where we were. See, the first virus actually was going away in March. You know, our president said something, it'll just go away. Unfortunately, it came back. It's something else. It was a different virus. So by April, we only had 2 places in our country that the first one, which was a D number, and it was in the 600s like this one is, and there was only 2 places left that even had any evidence that that first virus was still here. And so the one we have now is in the G, so you got D, E, F, G. Each one's over 1,000 mutations, and so we're in the G614 class plus mutations since then.
So as we go forward, though, the immunity, I mean, the vaccines, you keep re-engineering them along.
It is, and there is some research that I don't know how successful we're going to be. One of the newest type of vaccines is messenger RNA, which is actually done by Pfizer. It's the very first type of vaccine of its type ever attempted. There's other research that you may not be aware of, and that research is trying to find a universal vaccine for something in common with all flu viruses. So right now that same idea is looking to coronaviruses. Well, if we could do that, we could get rid of a lot of our cold viruses as well.
Yeah,
because
that'd be nice.
so the idea is this messenger RNA, you put it in the body, and that mRNA goes to your cells, and it starts replicating antibodies of this thing. Now the idea that you can find something that's in common with every virus, that you can disrupt its ability to transmit, to release its RNA, DNA, interrupt the capsule, or prevent it from binding to a receptor site. The receptor site is like on your cell. We have, where this one binds to is called the ACE2 receptor site, angiotensin converting enzyme receptor site. So it's kind of interesting. Many of you out there may be on ACE inhibitor, if you've heard that term, or an angiotensin receptor blocker. Turns out those medicines actually will reduce severity, according to Blue Cross Blue Shield study, by more than 40%, because it interferes with how that virus can bind in that receptor and then share its RNA and DNA into the host cell, alias you. And so that was kind of important finding. And there's other medicines that we're taking. You probably know what the president was taking, but it was some interesting over-the-counter things that we found that worked.
Wow.
So that universal vaccine would be the gold standard that all of us would like to see, where you could do one vaccine for all flus and hopefully one vaccine for all coronaviruses. That will be the goal. That researcher will get the Nobel Prize. I
want to buy stock in that company.
Absolutely. He's got my support, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, just had a thought about that, and it slipped my mind. I'm sorry. Let's talk about best. Oh, I know what it was. You were talking about prevention.
Yes.
Things that we can be doing now to make us more or less susceptible to this virus. And you've mentioned them before, but we need to be reminded again.
Really, honestly and truly, we could have probably cut no less than half of our deaths had we just kind of known and preached this. And some people think 70+% of our deaths by doing these things or more. And so there's two parts of this, and I'll say this could work for a school system. Should we have kids in school? My answer to them would be yes. But to do that, there's two things that happen. You got to protect the high-risk people. And so that means grandpa and grandma at home. Right now, when you're not attending school, grandpa and grandma are, in some cases, they're the ones taking care of the kids at home. It's not exactly what we wanted to happen, folks. That was not it. This is not about saving the child's life, because remember, they're 1/7 the risk, it looks like, by one study of that. So, or the high-risk teachers. So one is risk stratification, and each one of us has to do that for ourselves. And it has been done, because now we're seeing the incidence of this, a lot of our incidence, but even though the incidence is generally younger people, 20, 30, and 40-year-olds, average hospitalization age is in the 40 range now. It's dropped down considerably. But even considering that, we've gotten better with treatment. But anyway, the idea is that when you have high risk, you've got to protect yourself. And then the family needs to protect those that are high risk and help them and not force them into a situation where they're going to be exposed. So that's the first thing, is risk stratification. Number two is the other part of prevention is, what am I going to do to my body? Anything you can do to reduce, like morbid obesity, big risk factor, huge risk factor. You know, diabetes that's not controlled. Diabetes is a risk factor in general, but a diabetic that's in poor control, or a blood pressure patient, a hypertensive patient that's not in control. So one is putting yourself in control. The other one is healthy lifestyles. High sugar, I can guarantee you, is going to affect you, and there's many studies been done about high sugar, which is, our society has sugar cravings constantly.
Is that just it's not the weight gain, but just the sugar intake? It
is. Yeah, sugar, actually, high sugar intake has been shown with kids years ago, I mean, in early studies, about how it inhibits white blood cell function.
So, okay, let's say I don't have a weight problem, so I can eat all the sweet sugar stuff I want.
And that puts you at risk.
It puts me at risk, not because I'm gaining weight, but because...
Yeah, the sugar content is actually neutralizing the effect of your white blood cells. And so when you take a look at doing the right thing is always the right thing. and so we sometimes think we're escaping from certain things, but so what we eat is still important. Now, the other things that we want to look at, we know that the African American male is 3 times risk of death compared to the average COVID person. Now, I'd have to tell you, males and females, the females are the stronger species. They actually have a lower risk of death. They're in the low 40s, and we're in the high 50s. But African American males are high risk. Well, one of the things that we found out is vitamin D deficiency. 82% of African Americans are vitamin D deficient.
Is that because of skin color?
Yes.
Sun?
And you can see it in relative terms. Down Hispanic is nearly 70%. Caucasian is 40%. What happens is that somebody that has lower pigment can convert vitamin D to its active form, 2,25-dihydroxycholecalciferol. This is the active chemical form. Even the D3 has to convert to that. It's still got another stage after that. If you're taking the 50,000s, those are D2, and that's even further away. If your doctor's giving you, so when we look at that, if you want to see another one that you could do it for prevention, if I give you a list, I would probably go like this. I would say vitamin D is your first most important part.
Vitamin D every
Vitamin
day.
D.
How much?
Well, and that varies. Now, the maximum without monitored by a doctor is 4,000 a day. That's FDA guidelines. You should not exceed more than 4,000 a day. There are side effects from overdosing, and some people could at that point if you're not truly deficient. And there's some people that'll need over 100,000 a week just to get to normal. Those are the people that will die easily. That we're talking about huge thing. We talk about all these treatment factors. Remdesivir, which has never saved a life, by the way. It has reduced hospital stay, and it does work early on, but we don't have permission to work early on because it's a $5,000 drug, $1,000 a dose. So the president got it in the first 3 days, but you won't get it in your first 3 days because the hospitals are directed by IDGs, it's diagnosis-related grouping, and they only get paid for so much. So that only gets started usually at day 7 or later of your symptoms when you start getting short of breath. And the data shows it's never saved a life. It's the same as placebo. So when we look at vitamin D, however, we know that people that are very low, we've looked at 50 times the risk of having more severe disease by being vitamin D deficient. So huge, cheap thing to take care of. $10 will buy 400 capsules of 5,000 units. So vitamin D is probably the number one thing that's discovered today because it's involved with cancer, it's involved with autoimmune disorders, it's involved in this autoregulatory thing with our immune system, and so forth. Zinc is the other one. Virtually every hospital in our country and most hospitals in the world are going to give you zinc, and it's over the counter. Cheap also, right? We don't talk about cheap things, right? But anyway, zinc is, if I were to treat you outpatient or inpatient, most hospitals are going to give you 220 milligrams a day of zinc.
But zinc, you just don't take that every day of your life.
Yeah, not the amount we're talking about.
Yeah.
But what I'm doing for my patients is 50 milligrams a day, no higher than 100 milligrams of zinc in a daily dose, long term. Like if you're going to do it
You're
for a
talking
year.
about a healthy person taking zinc every day.
Or the high risk person, you know.
Okay.
So I'm not saying every child should be taking that amount of zinc, but I particularly want to focus on my high risk patients to have, because we know that there's difference. Remember what cures coronavirus before that we knew about, and if you've ever seen Coldies or if you've seen Zicam or the $3 generic version, the study that was started with that, 8.3 days was the average cold symptom, is 3.1 if you started that first 24 hours. So we know there's an antiviral and the antifungal effect with zinc. So by amplifying it above the RDA, the recommended daily allowance, which is 12 milligrams a day for an adult, and ramping that up. So if you know what the president was taking, he was taking zinc every day, and he was taking vitamin D every day. And then he had some other things that were over the counter like famotidine and Pepcid. He had melatonin, and he was taking aspirin every day. Aspirin, the clotting issues with this is a big part of our death rate too. So if you look at people that get to the level of ICU or intensive training where they're bedbound, this thing has a tendency to unmask other clotting disorders, and they can lead to pulmonary embolism, deep thrombosis, and intra-organ clotting. And so simple prevention. Now vitamin C, you don't want to be deficient in vitamin C either. We're not recommending super high doses of vitamin C. You'll see a lot of things. Linus Pauling was one of the guys that came up with vitamin C, but we do know taking some additional vitamin C is probably a good thing, or taking vitamin C in the form of other citrus fruits, if not. But so that would be a helpful thing. We know zinc and vitamin C also help with wound healing. We use that in wound care clinics all the time for bed sores and other wound care. So it has a dual effect with healing capability as well as the antiviral, antifungal. So looking at some real simple things that aren't very expensive, you could be saving a lot more lives than we've ever saved with our drugs. And that's what's being discovered. That vitamin D is the most researched vitamin ever in history. And it's just opened up a Pandora. And we first discovered it when we found out there was increased longevity with higher vitamin Ds compared to people with low vitamin D. And you won't know until your doctor measures you. And that's one of the things
Is there a difference between a generic or the expensive brand? Is that something that should be considered?
Theoretically, the chemical should not be any different. The typical difference between a generic and a brand name is the delivery device. And so those delivery devices can be related to what we call bioavailability, or how well they're absorbed or used in the system. And honestly, that very often is the most expensive part of any pill that you ever take, is the delivery device.
Okay.
And how it's released. And so the data is this: the average, the government allows it to be less effective. It has to be at least 70% or greater effective. But generally, generics are pretty close. It's just the delivery device. Now, if I looked at a throat lozenge with zinc gluconate, I'm going to use the generic. It's $3 versus $15.
Right.
And there's really not much difference in it, because of the way it's absorbed. It's going to be not a big deal. If it was a delayed capsule or a covered pill, something like that, that had to spread out over time, that would be a different thing. But so
Okay.
There may not be a lot difference.
We're getting close to closing shop here. Is there any other questions that have come in as of right now?
No, I mean, people have just been thanking for it.
Yeah,
We haven't had
yeah.
a whole lot of questions.
Well,
I
good,
think
good.
you've been
We've been
covering
sitting in medical school class today.
Yeah, no,
and
I've learned a lot.
I've learned a lot.
Appreciate it,
Yeah. But there is something I want to ask. A correlation between faith and disease like this is. I think you've done some studies on that.
Yes.
Faith and healing. So could you share? I mean, I'm not going to say that if you're a Christian, you're going to get your death rate's going to change. But then again,
But
maybe
it will
maybe
change.
it is. Huh?
But it will change.
It will change. You think you stand a better chance of surviving coronavirus with a solid faith than?
Yes, and now I don't have a phase study specifically on coronavirus, but there is over 180 studies that have p-value is up into the 0.001 range, which is powerful evidence from the scientific community.
Yeah.
Because they allow what's considered a good standard to be 0.05. That's
Right,
one chance
right.
out of 20 could happen by random chance. So you can get to 1 out of 1,000. The other thing is that you can look at 2 large studies that were related to anxiety or stress related. And what happened, one of the last one was in the spring of 16, and it was people that had lived anxious lives, whether they were treated or not, had a significantly higher incidence of cancer. And so when you look at what does anxiety refer to, and I'm going to tell you that that's a lack of faith. You don't know about tomorrow, today. The unknown is foreboding you. It's overwhelming you at this point. And so when we look at faith and fear, we have to analyze how we respond to life. And so we know that there's a couple of things that happen. One is that when we live in fear, that's the fight or flight response. And the fight or flight response was intended to be running away from the bear, but not every day, all day long. And so some people live in that environment, and by choice or not, or they just have a spiritual unrest. But here's what happens to your body. You start producing cortisol, prednisone. What does prednisone usually do? It suppresses allergic reactions. It suppresses your immune system if you take enough. We use it for transplant to suppress the immune system so they don't reject. And then the other things that are produced when we have this fight or flight response, besides cortisol, which we need some cortisol to exist, without stress stress-related cortisol is essential for life, and we could be extremely compromised. There are people that don't produce that. But the other ones, there's like epinephrine and norepinephrine that are produced in fight or flight. Vasoconstrictors cut off vital blood supply, increase heart rate, increase blood pressure. So there's a lot of things that we need to look at and pay particular attention when God's principles to live a life of faith. You know, so, and always analyze, if we're living not a life of faith, what are we afraid of? If we get to the point where we can be like Paul and we can say that, bring on my tribulations, my persecutions, just try me because my God's going to take care of it. But if you haven't gotten to that point in your life, beware, you're inviting health problems.
Yeah.
It's going to happen.
There's numerous studies on physical results of faith, the advantages of faith with the physical and with the emotional.
And you can measure it chemically.
Psychologically.
I may not have ever shared this. This happened at Oral Roberts University, and I was very fortunate to have been able to attend there, even though they closed. But we had 2 electron microscopes that were donated, and I got to see faith in a microscope.
Wow.
And this is wild to look at. They showed a picture of this lady, and we drew her blood out of one lady that was just in major depression, just anxious and nervous. And she had cancer, and she was just gave up, basically. And so they drew this blood, and we had these organelles, they're tumor necrosis factor and other types of things. But anything with one of the cells that surrounds the cancer cell literally looks like a little spiral in it. And this lady that was crying and just in tears, that she had pretty much given up, just drew her blood, they put it on the microscope, and that thing was dysfunctional. It was barely moving, and it was just trailing off. And they left it on the screen for about 2 to 3 minutes, and nothing ever happened to that cancer cell. This other lady that was a Christian lady that was solid, filled with faith, we went in there and we found one of the same cells. They watched it for the same amount of time, and it was wrapping around like this within about 20 seconds. Boom! And that cancer cell exploded. We went and found another one, 20, 30 seconds. Boom! Another cancer cell exploded. And so it's interesting that you can see our body's reaction to all of these other things. We might call them humors, bad humors. You know, if we're living an anxious life, because we're inhibiting God's own creation.
Yeah. Yeah.
He did not intend us to live in fear. He wanted us to put our faith and trust in Him.
Yeah. Yeah. And so be encouraged that you're on the right side.
Yeah.
Your faith, just faith, trusting God, believing in Him. There's power in faith. Be anxious for nothing.
Absolutely.
But all things give thanks. You know, and so there's Dr. Watts. Appreciate you sharing so much tonight.
Yes,
I
you're
know
welcome.
I'm hoping that it struck a chord in a lot of people, and we're going to go to Walmart and get our zinc and vitamin C and D, and not overtake it, but take the right amount.
Yeah.
And we're going to start cutting back on our
Make sure
sugar.
you check with your doctor on it.
And check with your doctor. It's always good to have the values run so that we know where our threshold is right now, and exercising and all of those good things.
It all makes a difference.
You know, if you think about it, you know, in Jesus' day, I mean, there weren't very many threats to your life, but we got to dodge cars and angry people. We're packed in rooms of angry people all the time now, and all kinds of things, you know, keeping us anxious. And but keep our faith, keep trusting God, be anxious for nothing. I think that's one of the healthiest things we can do for our body. But I hope this has been helpful to you. I hope you've enjoyed it and received something from it. Going forward, Dr. Watts, how long are we going to have to do all of this social distancing?
Well, one of the things we kind of delayed, our first line of defense, I hate to tell you this, we actually foregone that because we didn't really know what we were dealing with. We thought we were dealing with a virus that was 34 times lethal as a flu. So it scared everybody. We didn't realize. But I probably would not have closed down the schools, because the children, honestly, are first line of defense every flu and cold season, and including the GI season, which unfortunately COVID has it all in its symptoms. And So we do have a delay. You could expect this bump because we kept these children out for 3 or 4 months. But I think we're going to slow us down tremendously, getting the kids back to school. Just remember, we got to protect the people at home, protect our high-risk teachers at school. It's about knowledge with wisdom. We have to apply wisdom with all of this. And we're not going to get the right knowledge always by watching TV.
Right.
And so we've got to be careful who we put our trust in and when we're pursuing this. But we know there's a herd immunity that you could do with a very low-risk population. In the worst scenario, the low-risk population got this, it would end up having a 95% plus protection rate for the high-risk part of the population, even if we never had a vaccine. But thankfully, we've got treatments. We've actually reduced the death rate, we think, by our treatment values by 85%. And we haven't emphasized early treatment, outpatient, which is a hard thing because the government won't commit to tell people what to do. And we've got a number of things, if you read, that are being used in the hospital and being used in other countries that seem to work. They've all been tested for certain in a test tube, and now so many studies that we've had overlapping of people trying this in the field too. But anyway, I think we're going to do a lot better this next year. I can't say that we're going to get rid of it. Unfortunately, as Eddie mentioned, we could end up having a few-year process with this and trying one treatment and the other one is vaccination.
But we know a lot more about it now.
Huge amount more.
And I think we've learned a lot in the medical field. I think their body of knowledge has just been tremendously increased.
It's going to help with flu and other diseases.
Diseases that aren't even.
It's funny,
related.
We didn't even check some of this stuff out before.
Yeah, so good. Well, I hope you benefited from this. Pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for being with us. Next week, we're going to talk about forgiveness and the power of forgiveness. And so I hope you'll join us next week when we go there. A few weeks ago, you were talking about self-forgiveness with Pastor Eddie. And so this time we're just going to talk about just forgiveness, how I forgive others. And so please join us for that. We have been forgiven, so we need to forgive. And that's healthy. That'll help us physically as well, I'm sure, when we don't live with that burden of forgiveness in our lives. So Lord, we thank you for this time. We believe you've been with us here, and we believe that you've been speaking through Dr. Watts to us, helping us to live a more healthy and a more holy life. And we pray that as we follow you in spirit and in truth, that our lives will benefit the kingdom of God, and that we'll impact our world in a way we've never done before. We just pray, God, for the time when we can embrace each other and love on each other and get close to each other. And we just ask, God, that you'll allow us to have the wisdom to make that come quickly. We thank you for Dr. Watts and all those that work in the medical field that have been working tirelessly to make the world we live in better.